Clemson's good, we know that, but will they be vintage great? We got Ryan Cantor on the line from Shaking the Southland and TigerNet to help us break down key areas for this Clemson Tiger team in 2021. Ryan, we appreciate you stopping by as always.
Absolutely. Always appreciate the invite.
Yeah, let's look at the interior offensive line, because that's been a sore spot, especially, of course, moving out the elite teams. We saw it on display against Ohio State in a loss in the playoff last year. Your thoughts with 3 starters coming back out of the 5?
Yeah, so, I think people around Clemson's program, people covering Clemson have talked a lot about how Clemson's offensive line needs to get better. I think that's well established. But it's really something more specific than that, and you already kind of touched on it. It's the interior offensive line. It's run blocking in particular. They were actually 11th in sack rate allowed last year. So they kept Trevor Lawrence upright. He didn't get banged up too much. They lose Jackson Carman to the NFL draft. He went to the Bengals in the second round. But Jordan McFadden was the right tackle. He'll move over to left tackle. He was great. He was really their best offensive lineman according to the advanced stats. I think he'll be fine at left tackle making that move. He's going to be a strong tackle. And then you've got Walker Parks, who was a freshman last year and was great in a reserve role. He'll elevate, most likely earn that right tackle job. So the pass blocking and the tackles should be fine. It's the interior offensive line. They really didn't get a big push. They didn't open up the running lanes in the A gap. Really put a lot of pressure on ETN to anytime there was even just the smallest hole to turn something big out of it. That's why you really saw ETN become almost more of a receiver, and he's getting snaps as a receiver in the NFL now. Kind of worked out for his development in some ways, but a lot of it was because the offensive line struggled. They didn't get a big push. They were for as good as they were in pass blocking, they ranked just 51st in line yards, which is just a formula that sort of credits the offensive line for sort of the first couple of yards of a rush. So that's where they got to get more consistent. They lose their starting center, but they bring back both guards. And Hunter Rayburn had a big spring, and folks are really excited about what he could do at center. So this I think, is the most important position, and it's sort of boring to talk about interior offensive linemen. But I think the development of Clemson's interior offensive line, the starters, and more depth will be what determines if they win a championship, or still, even if they don't, still win the ACC most likely.
Ryan, it's not boring here at the Voice of College Football. We appreciate the interior offensive line. I try to give love to those guys as much as possible because we know what the deal is. People want to talk wide receivers, running backs, and we will get to that in just a second. But again, to outline your point, Travis Etienne, one of the most prolific backs in the history of college football, period, in that 8-yard per carry range, dropped to 5.4 his final season. And Lynn J. Dixon, even in his limited time at around 6 yards per carry, was at about 4.5 last season. So that speaks to the offensive line not getting that push, opening up lanes as well. So now we get to the game changers at running back and wide receiver, a whole different array of running backs, of course, with the young guys coming in. And then the wide receiver, hopefully Justin Ross on the field, and Clemson gets back to the standard at wideout that we've seen in previous years.
Yeah, well, Justin Ross coming back, I'm sure he's got a few more medical things he has got to clear, but it seems like pretty much a foregone conclusion. He's also moving to the slot, which will be different. He's pretty tall for a slot receiver. So that's maybe the biggest X factor in terms of playmakers that Clemson will have this year. And they lose a lot, even though the offensive line may be the number one thing for the offense. And even though they're losing so many playmakers, I think a lot of folks are optimistic because the offensive line improvement should make up for it and then some. Still, they lose 72% of last year's rushing yardage. That's mostly ETN and Trevor Lawrence being gone. And then they lose their top 2 receivers, 62% of their receiving yardage overall. That's Cornell Powell and Amari Rogers. And Travis Etienne, even their third leading receiver. So they're all gone. So it's a lot to replace. But I think Justin Ross is the biggest thing in terms of playmakers. Him coming back and the offensive line getting better to help the running game. How big of a factor are those two things? And I think it could net out to be a positive for Clemson.
Yeah, Justin Ross all over the place in these preseason publications, first and second team All-America teams. Joseph Ngata, Frank Latson, how much do you expect them to factor in?
Yeah, so last year I was writing preseason articles about how they were the 2 guys who were going to be the leading receivers, and then obviously it was Amari Rogers and Cornell Powell. So now it's sort of a year delayed, but I think, their third year, they have a great breakout opportunity. I don't want to, go back to the well again and be proven wrong again, but it was really more injuries. And I'm particularly a fan of Frank Latson's speed height combo. Whenever I see that, that's exciting when a guy can turn on the burners, but can also go up and get it. And Gotta might be a bit more physical, but I'm not sure that he's got the same quite like top end speed, at least from just kind of the eye test. The other guy that I feel like we don't talk about enough, or people don't talk about enough, is EJ Williams. He was great. He was one of Clemson's better receivers. He's just young. So even if Frank Ladson or Joe Nungato or both of them are struggling with injuries, EJ Williams is a similar receiver, and he's actually from the same hometown is Justin Ross. Very similar kind of player, even just younger. So I think he's another guy to be excited about in a very similar mold.
The voice of college football breaking down the Clemson Tigers, courtesy Ryan Cantor from TigerNet, also shaking the Southland on SB Nation. The defense was, of course, a lights out vintage Clemson defense in 2018, its last national championship. Pretty much held that standard against the bulk of the schedule the last two football seasons, but of course lit up by the likes of Justin Fields and Joe Burrow. The secondary loses Darian Kendrick, who moves to a place where you're going to see him, Clemson fans, on opening night, but it's going to be for the Georgia Bulldogs.
Yeah, boy, if Darian Kendrick gets an interception or a big game-changing play, that's going to be tough to swallow. And he's a big loss, but also Clemson focuses on character and sometimes gives up talent in the recruiting process, and I think the same applies in sort of the discipline of players. So culture first, and Georgia's getting a really talented player, so it adds a little intrigue to that first game. But at cornerback, they've still got some pretty darn good players. Andrew Booth has really flashed the ability to be that type of lockdown number one cornerback. I think he's got the potential to be a first-round NFL draft pick eventually. He's just got to be consistent, and now is his opportunity to kind of ascend to that number one cornerback role. And that number one cornerback for Clemson tends to get drafted in the first couple rounds. So this is his opportunity to kind of be that guy. And behind him, they have Mario Goodrich. They've got Sheridan Jones. So they've got a couple guys, but there's not a ton of depth. They've got Fred Davis and Malcolm Green behind them, and then freshmen. So they've really got to stay healthy at cornerback, or they could be in trouble. But I think Andrew Booth is I don't want to say next factor because I think people are pretty confident, but he's the guy who's got to be a lockdown corner for that cornerback group.
46 sacks. Sack rate number one in the nation among Power 5 teams, number 3 in the FBS. But I think for this group that's so much better than the rest of the conference, it's more about who are you performing against. They're going to be dominant against the bulk of the schedule. It's more about, is the pass rush going to help out the secondary against the elite teams once it's conference championship and playoff time?
Yeah. When we were talking about that stat before we were on air, I was it doesn't match up with the eye test. It seemed like last year they were getting near the quarterback, but never bringing him down is what it felt like. Tyler Davis, who's I think probably the best defensive lineman, probably the most important player on the defensive tackle, missed a chunk of games. Xavier Thomas and Justin Foster missed. Well, Xavier Thomas missed a big chunk of the season, and Justin Foster was out all year. So those are two big defensive ends coming back from injury. But I think their trio of starters, they'll have KJ Henry most likely at one defensive end, but then you've got Miles Murphy at the other defensive end. You've got Tyler Davis, and you got Brian Bresee. That may be the best trio of starters on any defensive line, certainly in the ACC. And they're older now, and they've got more depth behind them with the guys coming back from injury. So I think this defensive line should be much better. So regardless of what the stats say, I think they left some to be desired last year, and I think that defensive line getting better may be the biggest boost for the secondary, sort of how they kind of play off of each other. They don't have to cover so long when the D line's actually getting to the quarterback. So I think that may be the biggest boost in the pass defense. The pass defense was only 42nd nationally last year, which is pretty bad by Clemson standards. So I think the D line will help a lot. And then they were really fortunate to get safety Nolan Turner back for a sixth year. I think that's a huge boost that people want to overlook because he's not, a future NFL first round pick, but he's solid and dependable, and that's very much what they need, really what everyone needs, but this particular Clemson team needed on the back end.
You can check out Ryan's work at TigerNet and also Shaking the Southland on SB Nation. As always, Ryan, we appreciate you stopping by, giving us what to look out for against Georgia in particular and throughout the 21 season to see if this is just going to be merely a top 5 Clemson team or one that can do what has become the standard and seriously compete for a national championship.
Yeah. Let me give you one last tidbit here to leave you with. So Landon Zanders is the other safety opposite Nolan Turner. And he struggled at times last year, and then he was hurt and missed several games towards the end of the year. But what's come out now more recently that people didn't know during the season while he was struggling at times is he had a banged up shoulder that he was playing through. So coming back this year, he had off-season shoulder surgery. Coming back healthy, that gives a lot of reasons for optimism. So now you've got 6th-year Nolan Turner and hopefully a fully healthy Landon Zanders. That's another big X factor. So if the defensive line is getting more pressure, they're better on the back end. Andrew Booth steps up. This could be a nasty defense. I think if they can get by Georgia, and I think they can, I don't know how you bet against them.
Zanders, 25 tackles, 2.5 for loss, and 1 sack in 2020. And, of course, more games to play here in 21, hopefully, and the stats should improve for everyone. Ryan, we appreciate you stopping by as always.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.